Good afternoon, my dear colleagues and invited professors and experts on the energy area joining us from Singapore. It is very heartening to note that barely a month before, our Honorable Finance Minister of India, Madam Nirmala Sitharaman, mentioned that on record, our country has become $3.75 trillion economy. That's a fabulous growth given the fact that we were barely $2 trillion economy about a decade back. To be precise, in 2014, we were at $2 trillion economy. And the progress that we had achieved, clocking 3.75 today, is a model for any large economy around the world. Now, having said that, good news that we have become one of the fifth largest economy in the world today with $3.75 trillion output. Alongside, there is also some disturbing news in the sense that for any nation, as it becomes larger size of the economy, the dependency on the oil and other sources of energy would also go up. Without we do that, we can't continue to provide some kind of sustainable, decent living for the masses at large. Now, the country has made a tremendous progress, and not only has sailed through the 5-decade back 1973 global oil crisis. We have adopted a 4-pronged strategy according to the government Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas. One is diversification of our energy supplies that we have done reasonably well, may not be exceptionally brilliant in that particular field. Also, in terms of our NELP, exploration and licensing policy that was started almost like 24-25 years back, there's been a sizable increase. Now, almost like 1 million square kilometers of our territory is open for this exploration. That's also grown phenomenally to reduce the dependency on the international suppliers. Also, we have done some kind of, opting for better or less polluting sources of energy. And these measures are making us to feel greater comfort as well as some kind of a conviction that the kind of efforts that we have taken in the past few years have given us some kind of positive results. Nevertheless, this journey is much more ahead than what we could complete in the past 30, 40, or even 50 years now. Also, we have comparatively, we have developed some kind of a friendly relations with compared to 27 countries earlier to 39 countries today. That gives us a greater comfort that even if some disturbance happens because of a variety of reasons in the international scenario, in this world of snakes and ladders, still, given greater dependency on a larger number, nearly 40 countries, some of them are very prominent in the international map as far as the energy supplying capacity is concerned. That's a good thing that India has achieved, for which our policymakers deserve a compliment. Now, in terms of consumption, production, and where we lie as a nation vis-a-vis the rest in the region as well as around the world, we have now become a prominent consumer with the 3rd rank in the world. When it comes to production, we are in number 4, though 3rd and 4th there have a huge difference. I'm talking of production. In production, Russia is just 1 rank above, but it produces 2.5 times more than what India produces. And when it comes to the question of consumption, per capita consumption of energy for the 5th largest economy in the world today is far satisfying and is far under control. Though our dependency, particularly in oil, is about 80% on imports. Our consumption, given the climatic conditions, given lesser aspirations for the people of India on average, it's still much under control, under check. But as we become larger economy from here today, probably we may tend to consume more energy, and that could be a cause for concern. given our depreciation of home currency, particularly in relation to the US dollar. Now, we have some major suppliers such as Russia, Iran, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and of course the United States, which is a less prominent supplier of energy today to India. When it comes to a question of security in energy sector, I know very little except referring to the dictionary, which says that you have to have a continuous source of supply, either from internal or from external. Also, the oil should be made available to you at affordable prices so that your nation can bear with that even during the times of crisis, not when everything is fine or when the global oil prices are very affordable. Now, do we have that? I am no expert to talk anything on this matter today, even though I have said a little while ago that we are more comfortable given the increase in the number of suppliers or friends that we may have on the global map today than a few decades before. So that only gives us some kind of a assurance that we are now more dependable when it comes to the question of our suppliers than what we used to have, the kind of vulnerability or a dilemma whether somebody would be a friend even when the global disturbances because of wars or some other Cold War or any other issues of taking a stand. Now, would we be following the traditional NAM, non-alignment movement, or we have to take necessarily some sides, because only then some of the big nations which are supplying oil or other forms of energy to us, they think that you are taking a stance, but being neutral is an absolute strength. It's not that we are independent or indifferent, as was quoted in one of the recent books by our own ambassador T.P. Srinivasan in More Diplomacy. With these few words, I have extreme pleasure in welcoming two of the prominent guests for today's webinar, Dr. Asif Shuja and Professor Vandana Hari. Both of them have more than 2.5, 3 decades of experience in this field. One is into academics, that is the first speaker. I leave it to them whether they would like to speak first or later. Asif Shuja, who has extensive international experience, is presently associated as Senior Research Fellow at the prestigious NUS Singapore. And he has particularly special interest in working on international relations in Middle East and Southeast Asia. So he has been interviewed and he has been considered as an expert by various prominent electronic media that include the world-renowned BBC, Al Jazeera, CNBC, Channel News Asia, TRT World, to name a few, and also our own All India Radio, China Daily, etc. Welcome to you, sir. So I also have a privilege of announcing the presence of Ms. Vandana Hari. She has over 25 years of experience in providing intelligence on the global oil and gas markets. She researches and writes extensively, and she has served on the editorial board of prominent data supplying agencies. And she has her academics in arts and in the fields of communication and journalism. And she also has extensive expertise in writing as well as in providing interviews, both on television as well as in the other channels of news. That includes Bloomberg, CNBC, Yahoo Finance, BBC, Al Jazeera, Ashok, to name a few. So welcome to you, and over to my colleague, Dr. Satyendra, to take it further. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sukumar sir, for setting the tone of the today's topic is concerned. And the topic itself is very interesting in the current scenario. It's concerned India's energy security and the geopolitics of the sanctions. So as Professor Sukumar has set the tone, like, how important is the energy diplomacy at large is concerned at global level, regional level, and even at the individual country level about that. So not taking much time, I would request Professor Asif to take it forward the discussion and give us brief of like how this energy uh, context is shaping the geopolitical situations and where we have started actually and where we are heading to actually. Over to you, Professor Asif.
Thank you so much, Dr. Satyendra Upadhyay. Good afternoon from Singapore to all our audience, and thank you so much to Somaiya for inviting us. Somaiya has earned prestige in the management studies, we all know, and I'm happy that it has also come up with an institution on international relations on the same model. Indeed, the way international relations and geopolitics is taking us more and more towards the economic field, Somaiya's positioning in India's financial capital will be an added advantage. Today's topic of our talk is exemplary to that phenomena. During our presentation, I'll attempt to sketch the existing geopolitical terrain, and Vandana, my colleague, will enlighten us on how best India can navigate towards its energy security. India's energy security brings us to Middle East as India imports bulk of its oil from the region. Middle East security brings us to the US as it is the traditional security provider of the region. So we hear about something like Carter Doctrine, which was paused on January 23rd, 1980, which entailed that the US would use military force in Persian Gulf. However, lately, the US is pulling out more and more from this decade-long role in the Middle East. And we also hear about the US pivoting away from Middle East and towards our region, that is Asia Pacific, we are sitting right now. So why? Why is it happening? What is the role of sanctions in this endeavor? So far, the US has sanctioned 3 of OPEC plus members. This is not a coincidence. These include Venezuela, Iran, and Russia. It is just is it just a coincidence that these happen to be among the largest provider of or largest reservoir of oil and gas? Not at all. Led by US endeavor, the United Nations Security Council had imposed 4 rounds of economic and political sanctions on Iran, respectively on December 23rd, 2006, March 24, 2007, March 3, 2008, and June 9, 2010. We must remember here that when we combine both oil and gas, Iran is the largest reservoir of hydrocarbon in that respect. Is it just a coincidence? Subsequently, in 2018, when other signatories of Iran nuclear deal decided to stay put and not put sanction on Iran, the US pulled out of the nuclear deal. And now the US has imposed unilateral sanctions on Iran. Now, Dr. Shiv Kumar has said that we have US has very marginal role in exporting oil. But if you see and notice that now all Iranian oil is replaced by the US, is it just a coincidence? On 2nd December 2022, G7 and Australia agreed to cap the Russian oil at $60 per barrel, and this price cap took effect on 5th December 2022. China, India, and Turkey refused to be a part of this price cap. We must remember that oil revenues make up 40% of the Russian state budget. So was it just a coincidence? To understand these phenomena, we should focus on 2 facts. Why is it actually happening? The first is the US oil dynamics. We don't hear much about it, but I think it's very important for us to focus on every single change that is happening in the Middle East links us to the US oil industry and the shale gas revolution. And second, of course, is China's rise as much as India's rise. So we have been so used to reading Middle East history in an old format that we try not to see the reality which is what we see now. So I'll just focus on the reasons why the US is pulling out of the Middle East, and all subsequent changes that have been happening. There are four set of dates that we need to remember. The first is, of course, 1975. Why is it important? Because as US was the largest importer of oil from the Middle East, it was also working silently on its internal oil industry. So it was not sufficient enough for it to export, so it actually imposed a self-ban on its export. It was actually a ban by the US Congress. It was mandatory, so it could not export the surplus oil easily. So it happened until 2015. From 1975 until 2015, there was a self-ban on US oil export by US Congress. So it was by choice that it was not exporting. So it was during that time that the Carter Doctrine in 1980 came, through which the US assumed the role of a security provider. It said to its Gulf allies that we will be providing you security. Why? Because it needed that oil. So US as a security provider, we take it for given. My point here is that we should revise our understanding as much as US wants us to revise our own understanding. Then the second important date is 2013. What happened on that day? US becomes world's largest oil producer. Now many of the students don't even know that the US is the world's largest oil producer. It's not Saudi Arabia anymore, not in the Gulf. So what happened now? Since US was interested in Middle East primarily because of oil, so now that it is the largest oil producer, self-sufficient in oil, it is becoming less and less interested in the Middle East as far as oil is concerned. Now there's another important date, that is 2015. What happened during 2015? On this date, sales ban from the US Congress was lifted. So US could now freely export its oil to the international market. And do you see the coincidence? We have heard about the Iran nuclear deal. It happened also in the same year, 2015. So it is all linked, because Iran nuclear deal or Iran nuclear sanctions had happened there because US was portraying itself as the security provider of the Middle East. So it was ready to take the burden of the complexities that were there in the Middle East. Now the US became self-sufficient and also an exporter of oil. It became disinterested in providing the wherewithal of providing the security in the region. So it was offloading its burden. So Iran nuclear deal happened during that year, 2015. Now 2020 is the other fourth important date. And here US becomes net petroleum exporter. That's very important for all of us to understand. So when the US has become not just the producer, but also exporter, it is very important for an exporter to control the international market. Earlier, US was interested in oil because it needed it. Now it is interested in the oil industry because it wants to sell it in a profitable manner. So this is actually the new history of Middle East that we have to understand, the contemporary history of the Middle East. If we understand this, we can understand all the changes that have been happening in the current era. So to understand China is right, the year 2001 is again significant. During this year, two important events took place. We often do not pay attention to that. First was the terrorist attacks on the US territory in September. That was popularly known as 9/11. So what happened during that time? US became full throttle involved in the security of the whole region, and of course, Afghan was the extended part of that region. So it ventured into Iraq also later. It ventured into war in a full throttle manner. So while US was busy in these things, and China was silently growing, what happened in that year? Second was China's accession to the World Trade Organization on December 2001. The same year, 2001, September, US attack, and December 2001, China's accession to the World Trade Organization. It actually steered China's economy. So while US was busy in this war against terror and things like that in the Middle East, while of course its oil industry and shale gas revolution was happening, China silently started getting into the world market and it started rising. While the US was busy in its war against terror, China continued its rise under the backdrop of security provided by the US, to the extent that it is now challenging the US hegemony, US supremacy, and US position as number one. While the US was earlier the largest importer of oil, now China and India are the two largest importer of oil. So the Middle East security will inevitably be a cause of concern for these two countries, right? So what happens here is that the role that US was playing earlier in the Middle East to be a security provider, why is an important question? Because it needed oil from that region. Now that position has been replaced by China and India. Now it is China and India who need the Middle East oil. So it can be somebody's mathematical deduction that the role that US was providing in the Middle East for the same reason, it could be a high possibility that China and India would be providing same kind of role in the Middle East. Now that's why if we look into China's role in the Middle East currently in terms of Iran and Saudi Arabia rapprochement, and there are many other indicators you can see, that is trying to do it in a least cost manner. So this is how we can see that this is the geopolitics of the Middle East, and this is the water, the terrain in which India has to navigate in its oil, in this energy security. So I will stop here, and I think it will be Vandana who would be talking about India's energy security and how it would navigate in this terrain. Thank you so much. Vandana, over to you.
Thanks, Asif. And thank you very much for inviting me to join this conversation. And hearty congratulations to Somaiya University for introducing a course on international relations. And to all those who've joined us today and possibly will watch this later, I cannot stress enough through my more than 30 years of career, to what extent I've realized the importance of understanding one's country's position in the international arena, how India relates and works with or works against countries. And irrespective of what career you decide to pursue, I can tell you that understanding the international scene, how the world works, I mean, we can set geopolitics aside, simply international relations would be a great feather in your cap, irrespective of what profession you choose. Asif has laid out very nicely. Thank you, Asif. You've made my job easier, actually. I'm glad you went first. He's laid out very nicely the geopolitics, and I'll pick up the geopolitics of sanctions, the geopolitics of oil and gas, and just geopolitics in general with regard to energy security of import-dependent countries like India. I'll pick up on a few strands and develop them a little bit further. But the one thing I would like to, a wonderful point that Asif made, and which I would like to reiterate, is that keep in mind that everything is connected to everything else. I love the point, Asif, how you talked about 2015 and looking at how US removing its ban on crude exports and how it ties in with the Iran sanctions, the end of Iran sanctions, and how then US went on to become a major exporter, and how that ties in with US losing interest in preserving the security of the Middle East. Let me just take you a little bit for a 30,000-foot view. So as Asif has already mentioned, we have three major oil producers today under sanctions. No coincidence that it is all Western sanctions. Iran is under unilateral sanctions, of course, US unilateral sanctions, so is Venezuela. Of course, Russia is under NATO and G7, so multilateral sanctions. If you add the production capacities of these three countries, so I'm talking about capacity, not what they're producing, because clearly Iran and Venezuela are producing way below their capacity. Both of them can easily reach up to between 3.5 and 4 million barrels per day. If you just add their capacities, close to 17 million barrels per day of global oil production capacity is under some form of sanctions. And that is remarkable because we're talking about 17% of global supply. So when you think about oil and when you look at people talking about million barrels per day numbers, it's a very easy to calculate the percentage because just as a rule of thumb, you can take the global oil consumption as about 100 million barrels per day. I think probably for our conversation today, the most important is the current one, and arguably the biggest sanctions, which are against Russia. And I know there's a lot of debate, especially in the international arena. A lot of Indian government leaders, not in the least the foreign minister, have been put on the spot, continue to be put on the spot repeatedly in international forums as to India's decision to continue buying oil from Russia. The one thing that I would say on that count is that I feel I can see a very distinct shift in India finding a voice of its own on the international stage. And as Professor Kumar earlier mentioned, I think that is probably tied to India not being afraid to speak up because of the position it now occupies as a major global economy. So I believe some of that confidence has come as a result of that. But whatever it is, I think this confidence that India has in saying that we are not part of NATO, we were not part of the sanctions, you did not ask us before imposing sanctions on Russia, do not expect us to willingly follow those sanctions. We are a country that is focusing on energy supply security. We want energy affordability and accessibility of energy supply. We cannot afford to say we will not buy oil from Russia. And I think that sort of stance, an assertive stance, has stood the country in good stead. Going forward, I think India I think it has come into its own. It has found its voice on the international stage. I fully agree. I mean, I was just earlier offline before we began, I was speaking with your professors about, I would encourage you to see some of the Dr. Jayashankar's responses to international journalists and some very, very hard-hitting questions lobbed at him, as to how India can justify and how India feels, whatever morally, ethically, and so on. And he's given beautiful answers to it. I wouldn't even sort of, no point in my repeating them. You can hear them for yourselves. The bottom line is this, that yes, again, as Professor Kumar mentioned, India has more friends than it had several years ago, which is a good thing. But when you look at the energy markets, commodities markets in generally, and definitely oil, it is first of all, it's a very highly interlinked globally. One country's decision affects the rest of the world. In fact, the shocks transmit through the system within seconds these days. You have attacks on the Saudi oil fields. If you remember back in September 2019, that was over a weekend. On Monday morning, prices had gone up by 15%, which means every single consumer, other than those who are being shielded by government subsidies, had to pay for the Yemen Houthi rebels' attack on the Saudi oil fields, right? So it's very, very interconnected. That is an important point to remember. So when India says, how can we protect our energy security, affordability, and of course, accessibility is important as well, because there is still some substantial energy poverty in India. So one is, of course, I think, as I said, India has to be assertive. I think India is doing wonderfully by, some describe it as opportunistic. I would say it's just simply sensible and pragmatic that India is saying we will buy Russian crude, right? As of May, India got Russian crude on average about $25 per barrel cheaper than what it would have had to pay without sanctions against Russia. So that is, so I think this strand should continue. A few other things the country can do, and this is something that is always included in my recommendations to the ministry, to the policymakers and think tanks as well, is that India also needs to interact more, be more communicative with OPEC, now with OPEC Plus. So typically, Asif mentioned, the question is, would India and China now step up to protect the security of the Middle East? My personal opinion is that I don't think so. It's just not in the Asian culture to send send troops to those countries. So that won't happen. But I think there is a different way of diplomacy that India can adopt. So which is that I think India should be, should open regular channels of communication with the OPEC Plus members. It should continue conveying, how do we, because OPEC Plus will only be looking at what is the number we want for our budget, right? Saudi Arabia wants $80 per barrel. India needs to communicate, okay, if you want $80 per barrel in the current circumstances, you can assume that Indian demand will not grow at the same rate. Do you want that? Do you want to kill the golden goose, right? So India should communicate. That is very, very important. I think probably a third strand is India should establish its own strategic petroleum reserve. I think that's very, very important. So India has begun. It was quite late out the gate in this, but it can still catch up. So for the OECD countries, who are the vast majority of whom, except US, are also energy import dependent like India, they are recommended to maintain 90 days of net imports worth in their strategic reserves. If you look at India's strategic reserves, which have just started, current plan is only for about 40 million barrels per day, which is less than 9 days of India's consumption. So I think the strategic, in the event of external supply shocks, which no consumer country has any control over, an SPR can play a vital role in sort of shaving off some of the peak of price rallies. So I think these are some of the things that India can do, and I'd be happy to go into Q&A, and we take our conversation in the direction of wherever your interests are.
Thank you, Asif, and thank you, Vandana. I think it is really indeed a burning topic, as energy is all about fueling, actually. It could be either fossil fuel, either you say nuclear, either you say hydrogen or renewable energy. So various shape of the energy we have seen about that. So Professor Asif, I would like to ask one question. As you mentioned about the US becoming the world's largest producer in terms of the petroleum is concerned. So do you see a decline of the influence of oil producing state in the era of renewable energy, which we can see in these current decades going on?
Well, the money begets money. This is the concept, So the oil revenue is huge that they have accumulated. Now it depends upon how they are going to use it. I see there a lot of utility of this oil revenue is also in energy transition, in renewables, in developing new technologies. So if they are using it judiciously in transitioning themselves to future, so they can't become, or they can't remain irrelevant. So I see that there is a relevance of these countries when we transition completely to the new era. But that being said, I would say that in the near future, it will take very, very long time for the oil to become irrelevant. It's there to stay for many, many years, many decades for now. So they are actually going to stay there in the helm of affairs.
Thank you. Vandana, as you talked about OPC country about that, so the one question, if you can highlight, what are the prospects of the formation of group of oil consuming nations actually to prevent the whims of cattle such as OPEC, or you mentioned OPEC Plus also?
Yes, there is a this is a perennial topic. It comes up as one is that can consuming nations form a sort of a counter force, and the other is a NOPEC bill in the US, which has been doing the rounds of Congress for more than a decade. It has never passed both the houses of Congress in the US, and I'm told with guarantee, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat precedent in the White House, it will never be signed into law either. But it's not surprising that given how well OPEC and now OPEC Plus the past few years has managed to come together and to formulate policies and direct and strategize their production policies in a way to help themselves. This is a very logical question that can consuming countries do the same? Practically, I don't see it happening. So I think to my mind, it is more or less, it is a very academic debate. We can continue debating. We can write wonderful essays, I'm sure, in favor of such a sort of group forming. See, if you look simply at the world of commerce, when any number of buyers pool in to buy collectively. So one excellent example is that's what a lot of EU countries decided. In fact, all of EU countries decided to do in the wake of their the high gas prices that they had to pay after because of the Ukraine crisis, and they are now pooling in. So they are issuing like sort of a common tender to buy natural gas, and which has demonstrably proven that they are managing to get better rates as opposed to if the countries had gone individually into the market. Because you end up competing against each other. But by the same token, if you look at which countries could come together to form a formidable union of consumers, of course, China and India have to be together, right? The biggest buyers of oil. Can we conceivably think of China and India coming together into an alliance? The answer is no. So I don't think it will happen. But as I said, so it's more about India maintaining a good dialogue, ongoing dialogue with the supplier countries, with the producer countries, and just standing its ground. You know, do not get sort of pressured into making commercial decisions because of the political decisions by a completely different part of the world.
Yeah, thank you. And just to correct the one question, the one statement which you mentioned about 17% of the global supply. And actually in the today's newspaper itself, it has come like, you know, the benchmark of the Brent crude, which talked about 2022, where the yearly average was $100 per barrel. And compared to today, which is like a 2023 yearly average, between the last 6 months, 79.5 per barrel. And just last week on the Friday, when it comes to $76. And discount, because India was on the edge where getting the benefit of the discounts also about. So the recent development is also showing like discounts on Russian crude shrink 87% to $4 per barrel. So when you see this kind of changing dynamics, or maybe the advantage, so how long can India stave off the rise in energy prices, and that is causing havoc all over the world?
So the first part of your question, the report that you're referring to, I believe originally was a PTI report, and it has been shared by quite a few different publications. I would say take it with a pinch of salt. Unfortunately, my full sympathy is with today's reporters and journalists. I can tell you this situation with the Russia sanctions is so complex. Even people who have been in the oil industry for years find it sometimes hard to grasp all the technicalities and the complexities. So reporters don't always get it right. But so that aside, I think there is a couple of things to bear in mind. First of all, India, as long as the Ukraine war continues, and I think for the foreseeable future, none of us can see anything on the horizon to bring about a rapprochement there. So as long as that continues, I expect the Western sanctions against Russia to continue. As long as that happens, Russian crude will have effectively only two countries to go to, China and India. Essentially, that means it's a buyer's market. So as happens in the case of any commodity price, yes, the discount that India is getting on the Russian Ural crudes, it will wax and wane, depending on if Russia is actually curtailing its supply a little bit. You might have read, if you follow the news in the oil market. So then that typically shrinks the discount, right? Because there's less Russian crude available in July and August than it was in the first 4 or 5 months of this year. But as long as India gets any discount on Russian crude, right, it makes sense that for Indian refiners to buy that crude as opposed to comparable grades from the Middle East. I guess the second part of your question was, and I'll be quick on that, was how, look, India can't really save itself, because as I said, these are highly globalized, integrated, complex markets. If Europe gets less gas from Russia, starts buying more LNG, gas prices all over the world go up, right? If any supply shock happens, oil prices all over the world will go up. So India, unfortunately, with its very strong growing demand for energy, will remain vulnerable to external supply shocks and high oil prices. The short-term response to that, as I mentioned, is to have an SPR, which can at least shave off the peaks in the event of supply shocks. A longer-term response, and I agree with Asif there, it's a very, very long-term, slow-burning change, is to diversify your energy basket, include more renewables, which India is already doing. So your dependence on oil and gas will continue to grow for the foreseeable future, for the next few decades, I would think. But you can reduce the rate of growth by diversifying the energy basket into non-fossil fuel sources as well.
Okay, we'll come back to non-fossil fuel after a while. We'll pick up question, but we'll go back to the Asif, as you mentioned about the US influence in terms of this portfolio is concerned, energy portfolio. So as many people actually across the world, even in US, they are thinking like, threatening sanction on India for the trading with the Russia. They have a lot of questions, there are a lot of suggestions, like India is not taking a step, or maybe as foreign minister also has reacted on that. And do you think this threatening is a stern warning, or just is a bluff for the geopolitical geopolitical concerns they are trying to address through this?
Well, Dr. Upadhyay, my fundamental premise is that the sanctions are economic in nature. This is a business. It's not a moral tool, it's a business tool. So when you ask this question, whether US will sanction India or not, we'll have to get into the cost-benefit analysis, whether it will benefit the US or it will not benefit the US. Of course, you have the answer right. It will not benefit the US. You're sanctioning as great a country as India, third largest economy. It will be self-defeating enterprise. Of course, US will never sanction India, not at all.
I'll add to that as well, and I'll tie it in with one of the questions we have in the chat room as well, which is what is the difference between the sanctions placed on Russia and the sanctions placed against Iran. So I agree with Asif, and something very important to remember, through 2022, the Biden administration was under immense pressure because of high oil prices, which were raising pump prices in the US. Now, traditionally, historically, high pump prices in the US and the sort of dividing line for them is $4 a gallon, which by India, if you convert it to rupees per liter, will still look like a cheap price, but $4 per gallon is where sort of the US consumers start going up in arms. So when that happened, they were under a lot of pressure to do something to bring down the prices. And the US felt quite responsible in a way as well, because it had led this whole effort with Europe for sanctions against Russia. And that was one of the reasons oil prices were going up. So the US, if one, and now, of course, it's going to be election year next year in the US. I think the Biden administration is going to be very careful not to do anything that causes a reduction in supply of Russian oil into the market. So throughout last year, as they were unveiling these sanctions, working with EU and other G7 members, they kept reiterating that while we will not take Russian oil, we want Russian oil to continue flowing into the market because we do not want any shortages in the market. And we do not want that because it goes without saying in brackets that we don't want US consumers to pay more. We also have to keep in mind that inflation is a big concern in the US, right? That is driving the entire Fed interest rate policy, which in turn is now making the markets nervous about a recession in the US because of the unprecedented tightening. So all of that is linked to inflation, and energy inflation is a major component of inflation. So for all those reasons, the US actually wants oil to continue flowing, and it wants India to continue buying Russian oil. When you talk about some people in the US, it tends to be that is politics for you. Okay, so some people are typically on the fringes of the ruling administration or the political parties will, just to kind of get their name in the papers, will say, oh yes, this is what we should do and we should. But when Modi visited the US recently, Biden rolled out the red carpet for him. There was not one mention. All that they said to India was that please try and continue buying. It was a request. Please try and continue buying Russian oil under the $60 per barrel cap. Okay, it was not even put as a, oh, you better. It wasn't a finger wagging thing. So it'll not happen. Related to that, and this is the crucial difference. So as far as Iran is concerned, the market has gotten used to, so as we say in commodities, the loss of Iranian oil from the market has been priced in already in today's prices, right? So through some miracle, if tomorrow Iranian sanctions were to be removed, you could easily see prices falling another $3, $4, $5 even. So Iran is not allowed to export any at all. It does manage to export, but relatively small quantities to what it could potentially export without sanctions, which only go to China. Whereas Russia, so this is the big difference, but with Russia, there are sanctions, but sanctions are more like an embargo. So the US says we won't import Russian oil. EU says we won't import Russian oil, but it's absolutely fine by us for other countries to continue buying Russian oil. And they have put a price cap on it to try and shrink Russia's revenues, which is not something that has ever been done before with any of the countries that they have sanctioned. So it's a completely unprecedented measure, the price cap concept.
Yeah, thank you. I think understanding the situation need to look into holistically, not only the political angle only, because the real ground is work on the a lot of practicality. Asif, as you expertise on Middle East, so I would like to ask one question, looking into the changing dynamics when the moving from fossil fuel to renewable energy, how the Middle East is going to reposition themselves in terms of the still energy security player in the global supply chain?
I think we have answered it just now, there are two parts of it. One thing is that energy as hydrocarbon is not going to go away for a foreseeable future, in fact, for a long time to come. That's one thing. The other thing is that a lot of investment. You see, hydrogen. There's a lot of investment that has been made by Saudi Arabia, which is the largest, one of the largest producers. So all these countries have been making a lot of investment in that sector. So they'll be remain put in that sector. Now, as I said, that two of the largest economies, that is China and India, they are going to be one of the largest importers of oil from this region. So for this region to be important to these two big countries, that augurs well for these Gulf countries to become or remain important, right? Now, most importantly, as I said, for the US also, because although it doesn't need Middle Eastern oil, but it has to defeat, so to say, China. It has to defeat, so to say, India. So it has to control, because see, energy supply to China and India, one of the biggest, some of the biggest competitors. US will have to have some say, in that particular realm. So you see that OPEC and OPEC plus, we have so many countries in OPEC plus, and what is actually OPEC? Oil producing and exporting countries, right? So these are oil producing and exporting. The US is not a member, which is the largest producer of oil. So this creates a lot of dichotomy, and that is why US will be there maneuvering in one way or other, creating upheavals. So whenever these kind of upheavals are there, there will be some friends, there will be some foes. So these Gulf countries will be dependent upon these other countries like China, India, and there will be a vice versa, because they will be having their needs met by these countries. So both ways, in foreseeable future and long term also, they are going to remain important. Middle East going to be very significant in the future, as it is right now, is going to be significant.
Thank you. As in the last at least 2 decades, we have seen, and especially in these decades, when they are talking about alternate source of energy, and when the renewable energy is picking up every day, do you think renewable energy will be the next step for the energy security is concerned across the nation or at the global level? Any of you, or probably both of you, one by one, you can react on this.
Vandana will answer it better than me. Vandana, please go ahead.
So when we look at reports, news reports, or environmental organizations' reports on renewable energy, usually they play up the good part of the statistics, and there are lies, damned lies, and statistics, and you can put the numbers the way you want, and usually you will see a very impressive double-digit percentage growth number in the headline and the lead of the story. What some people do not then absorb from that is that the double digit is happening on a very small base. So that is the reality of renewables, unfortunately. Yes, it actually can empower countries that are resource poor. India is not necessarily resource poor. It has its own oil and gas, but relatively resource poor, because everybody has the sun and the wind, right? But there is an issue. If renewables have been with us for decades, right? Why haven't they already become a bigger share of the pie? The reason for that is that, first of all, renewables can only be used by turning into electricity, right? So can you fly a plane with electricity today? No. Can you run a ship with electricity? No. There are now electric cars, but again, and especially this part of the world and big chunks of the developing economies, the penetration of EVs is very, very low. So therein is one major bottleneck, that we need natural gas, we need oil still for a lot of the traditional ways that we use our energy. The other is the problem of intermittency. So when the sun doesn't shine and then the wind doesn't blow, power plants and electricity grids have to switch back to firing more coal or ramping up the natural gas based electricity generation. So all said and done, yes, renewables can continue to grow, but they will hit a ceiling beyond which you can't increase their share in the energy mix anymore, which is why a lot of people argue in favor of natural gas. So that is a far better transition fuel until we get more wonderful fuels, and maybe like hydrogen becomes a reality. But renewable fuels can not even be seen as a transition fuel. So they have these sort of impediments, which as of now, all the science and all the technology that we have in our hands we don't know how we can overcome these impediments. So they will remain an important part of the energy mix, but a relatively small part.
So you mean like suggesting the mixed energy rather than depending on the one sort of the energy, right?
Absolutely. But within that, again, I agree as what Asif said earlier. I think oil and gas will continue to play a major role, at least for the next couple of decades easily.
And when the United Nations is talking about SDG 7, when we talk about clean energy, how do you see, however, just now you explained that, but how this clean energy concept is going to be utilized by the current energy producer, especially the oil and gas you mentioned about, what you see the transition changes happening from the fossil fuel to this clean energy?
So I think as a lot of wise and pragmatic people have pointed out, oil and gas is not the enemy. It's the emissions from oil and gas, right? Similarly, from coal plants as well. Now, a lot of people have tried technologies to abate emissions from coal power plants, but those are very, very expensive. So there seems to be a sort of a global consensus emerging that we probably is best to just try and gradually move away from coal completely. However, the global south, as it were, or the emerging economies are arguing that we can't jettison coal too fast. That will be a big shock for our economy. So the developed world is starting to come around to that point of view. But when it comes to oil and gas, so it is about balancing. If we are agreed that oil and gas will continue to play a major role, then how do we abate the emissions in oil and gas? So oil and gas companies have already, through coming under pressure from the government's net zero emission targets, or coming under pressure from their own shareholders, from environmental groups, from environmental activists, from their financiers as well, they have already started taking these steps. So oil and gas companies, oil majors, national oil companies are all moving in the same direction. They're working very, very hard to look at technologies that can help them abate, to bring down emissions during the production process, to bring down emissions in the transportation process. And then finally, they say there is the emissions that happens from the tailpipe of your car, right? At the user's level. That they are saying, we don't have that kind of a reach to affect that, but we will try and curb the emissions that happen during the production and transportation and refining processes. So technologies like CCS, you might see these acronyms, or CCUS, carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies. I believe these will play quite a vital role in that. A lot of attention goes towards carbon. Not enough people talk about methane. So methane is a far more potent gas, GHG emission that happens from oil and gas fields as well. So a lot of countries, governments are starting to put pressure on oil and gas companies to also tackle GHG or methane emissions. Sorry. So I think it will be more tackling the emissions. So can we continue using oil and gas, but use it in a more cleaner way?
Yeah, so that's what SDG also try to address about responsible consumption. Yes, Asif.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because see, the discourse that Vandana has just described, I'm just recalling that Singapore, since both of us are sitting here, is one of the largest refineries of one of the largest hydrocarbon, one of the largest trading hub of hydrocarbons. Okay. And now it's been cherishing the ambition to become one of the largest carbon trading hubs. So, the relation between the two, and I think this is one of the, emission. Vandana has so much highlighted on emission. That's why I was recalling this. I think this is one sector where India and Singapore can have very good cooperation, I think. I was just thinking about just mentioning this. Thank you. Sorry.
No, actually, you read my mind. Actually, my next question was on Singapore itself, because you guys are, and Singapore is a model of that. I think there must be a learning how being in a small geographical region, but still how they can contribute to the climate change, at large about that. So thank you for answering question. If anyone has a question from audience, feel free to put your question in chat box, or you can unmute and ask.
Can I just make a comment on
Yeah.
Singapore while we are waiting?
Yes, sure.
Yes, in some ways, some countries can look up to it, but in a lot of ways they can't also, because this is such a small city state. It's far easier for the government here to manage things. They are so it's almost like a lot of countries do pilot projects. So Singapore's size is such that you can actually do a pilot project in the entire countries. So a lot of these strategies that work in Singapore are sort of, I would say, boutique. They may not be scalable and as a result applicable in certainly the size of the country of the size of India. But one thing I will mention, which again is a point I make at every forum that I get, the one thing that Singapore is doing fantastically well is developing public transport. Very good, efficient, clean, reliable, affordable public transport. It has now just in my area, like my nearest train station was about 10 minutes walking distance now, which is nothing, right? And from there I'm connected beautifully to almost all of Singapore. But in the hot and humid weather that we have around the year here, even 10 minutes walk can be too much. Now I have an MRT station, the MRT, the train, the metro of Singapore. There's one coming right next door to my condominium. And as a result, also, the government has declared my area as a car light area. So the government will do everything in its power to put more public transportation in place for us, but will also do everything in its power to make car ownership to make it unpalatable for people to own cars in the area. So I think ultimately, I think this is a solution that is unfortunately countries do not pay enough attention to. In India, I know there's metro and all of that, but I believe in the last few years, much more highways have been put in place. I know my friends and family like more and more to drive now interstate, right? So it's actually counterproductive. I think mass public transport is what I'm talking about. I think that is a very important part of the solution to reduce our carbon footprint.
Yeah, exactly. And just a few weeks back, when I was talking to the GM of the Best, in Mumbai, and a lot of, I think, change are happening. But as you know, the country is different from the Singapore, where you have the use metro pilot, and here you have mass scaling up. So like here, the Best is coming up by 2030. Entire bus is going to be electric, no fuel-based. The fossil-based energy is going to be used. So I think it's time taking because it's not very easy to address the the issues, especially the larger country like India. But yes, changes has begun. It takes time about that. Any other question from the audience? Otherwise, I will have few questions from the student point of view. This session has been more on the experts' perspective, like how the energy security is concerned and the geopolitical sanctions we have been discussing about. So the question from the student perspective, how do you see a student, especially from the international studies perspective, relevant knowing all these consequences, impactful situations in their career, and how they can take leverage in terms of the career ahead? Because ultimately, learning has to also, for the young people, learning has to reflect in terms of the stability in their career. How do you establish the correlate, equation from learning to career building kind of things for these students? Yes, Asif.
I know Vandana has her own thought because she has been writing profusely on energy and the interplay between public and private sector But from the academic point of view, I have something to say here. Because see, the best way of learning for the students, or the best method of imparting the learning, is to make them believe that what you are learning has utility. You know, so the best way is to have some hands-on experiences while they are learning. This has been an international norm, like embedding the students with some industry, providing them some opportunities for internship. So this is a two-way process. The academic intake that they have already have, they will be infusing in the industry, because all the latest learning, and the industry will be imparting some of the hands-on approaches to the students. This is a very practical approach. So internationally, I think this has been practiced. In India also it has been practiced, but I think it should be practiced even more profusely. So this is all I have to say on this.
Yeah, Vandana, quick comment on this.
Yeah, so I think first of all, just if I contrast today's India with the India that I grew up in, I would say relatively our country was more insular back then, more than 30 years ago. What somebody else took decisions did not matter so much for India. The decisions India took did not matter so much on the international stage. That has completely changed now. So, the globe has shrunk. So as I said earlier, if you're doing international relations, try and understand India's position, where India comes from, how it relates to its neighboring countries. I know that gets relatively more press coverage in India, but as again, we've been discussing over the past hour, it's what US decides, what NATO allies decide is also having big implications for India, right? So I think that awareness, that understanding of where India fits in this sort of jigsaw puzzle, if you will stand you in good stead in sort of any profession you take. Increasingly, because of this very complex, multipolar, but sort of a world that has shrunk, increasingly as a result of that, a lot of companies, international as well as national companies, give a lot of importance to understanding geopolitical risk. So there are entire sort of companies being based that are just offering nothing but analysis of geopolitical risk. So if you're so inclined, you can go into that area, having studied international relations. You can, of course, you can go into politics. You can go into administrative service. I think increasingly Indian administrative service, of course, foreign service traditionally, yes, but administrative service in India also, I think, will benefit hugely from people who understand how India relates to the rest of the world. If you're so inclined, if you like the energy or the commodities markets, absolutely, commodities companies, whether they are producers, traders, major consumers, they like to have a good analysis as well. So something, if you are interested in developing yourself in international relations, I would say try and also brush up your skills on communication, because there is no relations without communication, right? So how do you speak? So have some clubs, I would suggest, where people have to do extempore, just take any international topic of the day or national topic, just talk about it. So improve your communication skills, verbal as well as writing. Of course, the power of social media today cannot be underestimated, right? So whether you're writing in 280 characters or whether you're writing an essay, long form, you have to be able to articulate. Because, I mean, again, I'm sorry, I'll go back to Dr. Jayashankar again, right? If he wasn't articulate, he can be as brilliant as he likes, but if he wasn't articulate and he gets 40 seconds on that international stage, all the cameras on him, right? 40 seconds to give an answer to a really hard-hitting question. If he is not articulate, if he hasn't gathered his thoughts beforehand, how is he going to make the most of that 45 seconds? So develop your communication skills as well.
I think it's a great tips for the young generation is concerned to play the bigger role in the coming years to come for India at large, actually. And I think the topic is very, very thought-provoking and very relevant from all the angle. So time is always less to discuss all those things, but we'll stop over here due to time constraint. And I hand over to Professor Upadhyay for the vote of thanks. and his comment. And Professor Dinos Upadhyay is heading the International Studies Department at SK Somaiya College.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Really, it was very insightful discussion. And on behalf of the Department of International Studies, Somaiya Vidyavihar University, we express our sincere gratitude to both Dr. Asif Shuja and Ms. Vandana Hari for sharing their ideas on very quite relevant topic, both global politics and also Indian foreign policy, India's energy security. Really, it is today's discussion. We had the opportunity to hear their thoughts, and this will surely provide us, encourage us to our future research, also teaching. We would also like to thank Professor Siva Kumar for delivering welcome remarks. Also thank our esteemed moderator, Dr. Satyendra Upadhyay, for conducting this proceeding diligently, and as well as making the contribution to the debate also. We are also sincerely thankful to our Vice Chancellor, Professor V.N. Rajsekhar Pillai, and Director SK Somaiya College, CA Monica Lodha, for their valuable inputs and guidance. And we would also like to express our sincere gratitude to the ID Department's Welcome Center, especially Mr. Aman Sharma and my colleague Gokul for their constant support. Yes, last but not the least, my deepest gratitude to the audience who have joined us today and participated in the discussion. With this, we come to end of our very productive discussion. Thank you all once again. Thank you so much.